You're listening to dkitalk.com. And I had said to you before, leaving aside concerns about whether computers can be hacked and whether people tell lies or all the rest, all my sense all the time is that if I went in, two things would happen. If I go into a machine and I press 1, 2, 3, 4 and it goes into the computer, two things happen. The computer does all the number crunching itself, and basically whatever you put in, you get the right answer. I mean, we trust that computers work our bank accounts, so we obviously believe in computers to that degree. So the first thing, we'd have an instant result, which kills a lot of the fun around elections and the torture and all this. But my interest was two fronts. Firstly, the potential non-reflection of the public's absolute view. For example, in that example I gave you in Murphy, that 6,500 votes of Murphy's number one, if that person had 6,500 number twos of his brother, for example, they'd never be seen.
They weren't reflected later on and didn't come into play.
In fact, and then the other thing is what you said is in terms of the way the proportionality kicks in to a surplus where you have more transferable votes than you have a surplus.
Correct.
Means that no matter which way of randomness, you have a defined randomness by your process, which wouldn't. Now, the reason I thought was interesting about the computerized thing is that, firstly, all of that could be simply carried out in a fraction of a second by the number crunching. You could actually have an absolute accurate proportionality.
Yes.
But the other thing that I found of interest was that, let's say you've 20 candidates in a race, which increasingly in elections we often have. We could have candidates who might get, out of 80,000 valid votes, they might only get 100 votes. But it is perfectly possible that someone who gets 100 number ones could get 20,000 number twos.
Correct.
And in the present environment, they'll never even know that, right?
Yes.
Now, in a computerized environment, the reason I thought it was interesting is that if I was interested in the life of politics and I wanted to work out strategies for change, at least if I knew where I was in terms of proportionality, then, I know I got, for example, I might find that I got a lot of number sixes, but that above me in the system was 4 from one particular party. So basically they came from one family of thinking.
Yes.
And so if I were to change strategies, that's one of the major advantages that I would have found that computerized information would give us. So that.
Yeah.
The other thing I also wondered was almost like the way you vote in the Eurovision. If you changed it so that you put a figure for waiting for votes for number 1, 2, I mean, I question myself, if, for example, somebody gets...
Well, I suppose that leads on to kind of an interesting...
A different type of
the Eurovision,
proportional representation,
Sometimes people go into the election, and I know myself, I conduct the student union elections in the college, and you sort of see the way students vote there. And some of them go in with the Eurovision mentality.
Oh, so they think 12, number 12 votes.
Number 12 is really good for a candidate,
and
number 1 is bad.
Sure.
So you're never quite sure what the person is actually voting for. The other interesting thing is, if there's 2 elections on the one day, in the student union election we had 2 elections. We had one for president.
Oh, for 2 different positions.
For 2 different positions, and one for vice president. So I saw one particular person coming in voting, and they did one on the paper for the president, and then they got the vice president paper, which was a separate election, and they put 2 on that. So that kind of leads to an interesting scenario as to which was valid or which wasn't invalid. Now that also happens in national politics. A couple of years ago, I think it was 1989, in the European elections, in the Munster constituency, there were several other elections. There was local elections and maybe urban elections if it was in the town. And the counters found in some of the European papers that the voters actually started with number 5. What they'd actually done was they'd voted 1, 2, 3, 4 in the council election.
Right.
And that was a separate election, and put that paper into the box. And then they got their European ballot and they started with number 5 and number 6 and so on. That was in Munster. The same thing happened in Leinster. The 2 elections obviously happened there the same day as well. Now, the returning officer in Munster looked at these papers that said 5, 6, 7, and they decided, well, okay, it started with number 5, so that number 5 indicated a first preference for the candidate. So that paper was taken to represent a valid vote for that particular candidate, and so on down the line. Now in Leinster, the returning officer actually took the opposing view. They actually took the view that number 5 wasn't a valid start, that perhaps we were in Eurovision mentality. Did the person go 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? And did the person think that number 10 was a better vote than number 5? So that returning officer actually deemed that those papers weren't valid. And I think it was in Leinster, I think it was Michael Bell, he was very close, it was kind of a tight affair, and there was a recount. And the two decisions ended up in the court. I'm not sure was it the High Court or the Supreme Court. And the actual ruling eventually was that they actually stood by the decisions of the two returning officers, even though the decisions were opposing. So it was within the returning officer's discretion to make a decision based on what way they found the papers. Now, I'm not sure if the legislation has been updated in the meantime to sort of clarify situations like that, but as I mentioned earlier on, it sort of says if there's some mark indicating a first preference. So it's possibly still with the returning officer to decide whether a number 5 is a first mark of preference, like indicating number 1. So I thought that was kind of an interesting situation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, if I just review that period of conversation we've had, that, I mean, you're a mathematician, your background, your profession is in relation to mathematics. And, you know, the large population of the country, we're going through phenomena where, for example, in the Leaving Cert, we have high failure rates in mathematics. And we have many students who, once you put any sums on the board, all are just running a million miles away.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we're still earning a lot more euro, everybody in the country, than we were 10 years ago. We're handling larger sums of money. And, you know, I'm asking myself about the vast swathes of people who are actually employed in the accounts centre implementing these rules. And sometimes I wonder, does anybody know who's driving the bus? Has anybody a clue about what's going on?
How to do, it's fairly well defined.
Is this, that's what I was going to ask you. Where is this set out in a document as to the way in which this is done? You referred to a piece of legislation earlier on there. I think was it the 1992
I think so,
Electoral
1992 Act, yeah. Oh yeah, it would all be clearly laid out in legislation. If people were interested, they could go into the Oireachtas website and go into some of the electoral acts and look up to 1992, and it's pretty much all there.
And, you know, interesting enough about, you talk about an informed electorate, because if democracy, I mean, whatever level of cynicism one has about the fact that no matter who's elected, you don't have a say. Anyway, that might be a different question. But, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about student elections within various institutions in education is a very good practice ground, isn't it, for educating the electorate for how to, you know, the nuances of what goes on, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Because, you know, we're talking about whoever is elected to run our country, you know, determines the quality to a large degree of our lives. And in a sad situation where perhaps we've a poor turnout, like if we're in a situation with 50% turnout, the question is that represented, or the people who are elected represented the people of the country at all? Yeah. But if this is the model of democracy we have, the question of being able to get people of a younger age to implement these structures, playing these games around voting, even in classes, to have a little election in the class to play it out on simple numbers. Because it does, go back to the whole thing we started off, some people just go in and write 1, 2, 3 and for the party and then walk out. And in many cases, the sort of let's say the marketing strategy of the party is very much, I remember...
well, that suits the party from their point of view. That's what they would love. If people just go and do 1, 2, 3.
But also, you can think you're quite clever in terms of deciding that I'm going to vote for the independent people in the way in which I do. But in fact, when your vote goes off at C, very quickly it can be, after maybe it's number 2, you really don't know where it's gone after that.
Well, that's the thing. I suppose the other interesting thing is...
although, can I say I'm wrong with this? If you knew that, say, in 12 candidates, there's 4 or 5 of them who are really going to be down at the bottom end, if you knew that there isn't enough votes at the bottom end before somebody exceeds the quota, your vote stays live up to 5 or 6. It really only gets lost after somebody exceeds the quota and you get into surplus.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. I suppose the other interesting thing is, you know, people that listen to election results and that, and you have all sorts of discussions going on the radio and analysis. And there was one candidate, I'm not sure which election it was, and, you know, the reporter asked him, why didn't you get elected? And they were expecting all sorts of analysis and sort of suggestions and that, and the person just said, well, I simply didn't get enough votes. I simply didn't get enough number 1 votes.
Well, in a sense, that's simplistic, because the people who just walk in certainly do. But I mean, was it in Limerick in the previous election, and maybe it was 2002, that, I mean, a vote or two can swing an election.
Oh, yeah.
And in a recount, given there's a lot of manual handling, I mean, it is possible in a recount for an election to turn, and governments can fall, or be formed or fall in relation to this. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance. And the other thing is, I often talk to a number of students who are voting for the first time in 2007, and it was interesting to realise that it is the one element of democracy we still actually own, is the right to vote. Now, we mightn't have much of a say, but I mean, isn't it sad when we don't see people believing in the power of their vote?
Oh, yeah.
And I think the more that they work on examples like, the more they realise, well, at least I can do my bit insofar as it is.
Sure, yeah. I suppose just to wrap up on the how the count works, we've kind of used simple examples just to get the main points across. The two main aspects of PR were the elimination process, and the other aspect was the transfer of a surplus, and then if a surplus arises later on, the transfer of it. The other it doesn't involve numbers, but how does the count actually work? Let's say at the end of the first count, a candidate has got a surplus. Now, the returning officer can look at the overall scenario and sort of see, well, okay, Dermot Ahern has a big surplus, or maybe a small surplus. Seamus Bellew has only 5 votes. What's the common sense thing to do? Well, you sort of look at Dermot Ahern's surplus, and the returning officer would sort of say, well, if I gave all that surplus to Seamus Bellew, would it lift him up over the next lowest candidate? And it probably wouldn't. So the returning officer can sort of postpone the distribution of the surplus, because distributing the surplus, as we've seen, is complicated. So we know that Seamus Bellew is going to eventually get eliminated, even if he got all those votes. So the sensible thing to do is to eliminate Seamus Bellew first. Just look at his number 2s and just distribute them on quickly. And we'll say at the next stage, if Liam O'Gogan was the next lowest candidate, and even if he got all the surplus, would it lift him over the next candidate? And let's say it didn't, for argument's sake, then Liam could go. So you could keep eliminating people as long as the surplus wasn't going to help them any further.
So you often see that down at the bottom of the food chain, where you bundle up, people get a couple of hundred votes here, there.
That's right.
And when you add them all up, there's still 1,000 of a gap between them and the next person.
Exactly,
so
you bundle them all up together and eliminate them together. And you postpone the surplus for as long as possible.
Right.
Now, the other interesting thing is...
and again, it's important to point out, there's nothing underhand or anything about that. I mean, mathematically, that stacks up.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, all the stuff is there to see, and people can challenge, the candidates. The returning officer shows the candidates what's happening in that.
When we talked about having this conversation first, it was in the context, Seamus, of your thoughts about doing a presentation, a public presentation of some of this information. And hopefully this podcast might serve as a preliminary or sort of, I suppose, as a pre-feeder to that conversation. Tell us a bit about your idea around that.
Yeah, well, there's a thing called Maths Week, and it's a national event, and it's happening all over the country. It's a 32-county event, and there's different events going on in the colleges and schools.
And when does that happen?
It runs from the 15th of October to the 19th, Monday the 15th to Friday the 19th. It's always at the same time every year. It coincides with the birthday of a mathematician called Hamilton.
An Irish
mathematician. Right. And it's the 16th of October. And so Maths Week runs during the week of the 16th of October. So we're open to have an evening event in the college where we'll tease out the ideas of proportional representation, and people are welcome to come. And
I think it would be interesting if people had a chance to listen to this beforehand, to either challenge for clarification or seek clarification, or perhaps challenge interpretation around this. Because I think one of the things that come out, even as we've reviewed this today, is that it serves anybody, even if you know it, it serves you well to go through it again, to clear it in your own mind. Isn't that right?
That's right.
And remember, of course, we only have national elections every 5 years, so people have to dust the cobwebs down every 5 years and try and remember how all of this works,
Yeah. Well, just on 2 other final sort of small tidbits. For all the complications of PR, if we just, let's say there's 20 candidates in the election and there's 4 seats, if we just count the votes, the number ones, no complications, it's a general rule of thumb that the eventual 4 winners will come from the first 5 or 6 candidates. So for all the complications of PR, if we just count the votes, we can generally say, just as a rule of thumb, that the 4 seats will be filled by the people from the top 5 or 6 candidates. If you look through the results for the last 5 or 6 elections, go through all the constituencies, you might find, oh well, the number 5 candidate actually did wind up being elected in a 4-seat constituency. Maybe a number 6, but that's rare enough. Now there was one exception in this election, which is kind of unusual, and it was in the Taoiseach's constituency. Cyprian Brady was about number 10, and he actually ended up being elected in a 4-seat constituency. So I'd say Cyprian broke some sort of a kind of a jumping record. He jumped from 10th place into a position of where he was elected.
But that's very much a prime example of strict, very disciplined vote management.
Correct.
Isn't that right?
That's right. The Taoiseach ended up with, let's say, a surplus of 5,000 votes. And the management was so strict that practically all those 5,000 votes went to Cyprian Brady. You know, the portion thing was done and so on, but the management was so tight, it was as good as Cyprian getting 5,000 number ones. And that sort of bumped him way up into the position where he was elected.
Because one of the things about my small experience of being in election stuff is, I mean, once you start working with people or meeting people who've been in the vote management business or heavily into this, I mean, they can literally sway the energy from one element, from one part of a constituency to another. Yeah. And really, people in one street have been told, you vote for that person, our party, vote for that person. And you know, you would be very naive and innocent just imagine that you're getting into election on the basis of what your policies are and sure the people will like me or won't like me, or even will or won't know me. I mean, in County Louth, for example, in the last election, I mean, it would appear that the vote management by Fianna Fáil very much was able to absolutely ensure that Seamus Kirk in fact topped the poll, where there was a question beforehand as to whether he'd survive at all.
Well, generally in parties, to use that example, there was 2 Fianna Fáil candidates, and they were hoping their 2 candidates would be elected. So the strategy always is to divide the vote equally between both. None of them might get elected in the first count, but if they're both sufficiently high, they'll pick stuff up later on as the counts proceed. The danger is that one of the candidates, let's say it was perceived that was Dermot Ahern, that Dermot would romp home with an excessive surplus, and then that Seamus Kirk would be way down the pecking order. And the problem then is that surplus would melt away and that it wouldn't transfer in its entirety. So to maintain the tight discipline, have both candidates do very well close to the surplus, close to the quota, not quite getting to the quota, and then that they both pick stuff up and eventually they both get elected. It's like 2 horses running in together at the same pace. Right.
So Cyprian Brady was highly unusual in that extent.
That's correct.
In the design objective, he would have been closer to Bertie after the first count.
That's
Bertie
right.
would have less of a surplus.
That's right.
But there was a couple of places where there were massive surpluses. There was one in Willie O'D.
Well, Willie always
also with Seamus Brennan.
Sorry?
And also with Seamus Brennan. They had massive surpluses.
That's right. Well, Willie always gets an excessive quota. For anybody that wants to study electoral counts, Limerick East is the place to go, because Willie always gets a surplus, and sometimes Michael Noonan gets a surplus. So we have 2 surpluses to start with, and they usually have to get distributed. So if you want to get into good maths, go to Limerick East.
Right.
Now, the final tidbit of trivia, I suppose, we've gone through the rules for a general election. Now, the rules for Seanad Éireann are pretty similar. It's based on PR. The rules are generally similar, the whole distributing of votes using PR. Now, in the college, we have elections for the Academic Council every 5 years. And it would reflect a multi-seat constituency. We have a constituency that has 4 seats, and we have so many voters, and we elect the people. And the Academic Council elections are based on the Seanad Éireann election rules. Now, in the last Academic Council for one of the constituencies, the returning officer made a mistake. He actually did the count based on general election rules. And generally that would be fine, there wouldn't be any difference. And it was later on, the count was over and the end result was tight. So we had to have a recount. So it was in the situation of the recount that we checked how the election was conducted. And we realised that the election wasn't done based on the Seanad rules, it was done on the general election rules. So we went back to the drawing boards, did it based on the Seanad Éireann rules, and did the recount. Now, as a result of that process, on the 5th seat, a different person wound up getting the seat. And it was basically to do with the order in which things are done. Do you remember earlier on we mentioned in the general election that if somebody like Dermot Ahern had a surplus at the end of the first count, we could postpone the distributing of that surplus if Seamus Bellew had only a few votes.
Yeah.
We eliminate him first and get him out of the way and then maybe distribute the surplus. But in the Shannon Ahern elections, the rules say that if a candidate has a surplus, that has to be distributed first, irrespective of the lower candidates.
And of course, in this channel, there was 24 candidates, so there will be a lot of people right down at the bottom of the food chain going nowhere, including
But
me.
it was just an interesting in which the order in which things are done, that different candidates could get elected.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, that's what, I mean, I think one of the things that jumps out of my conversation with you about this is that the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8, actually, those little fibrillations that happen can have nuance effects, as you call it, melting through the system. You
That's
know?
right. Yeah.
Anyway, just if anybody's interested in further conversation with you, Seamus, about this, they can reach you on seamus.bellew@dkit.
That's right.
And it's on the date in October. It's the 14th
it's the week of the 15th of October.
The week of the 15th of October. We'll have some more information about an evening discussing this information.
Yeah.
All right?
Yep.
Thanks, Seamus.
Thank you very much, Tim.
You've been listening to dkitalk.com.